Hey everyone, it's Richard. You're watching The Plain Bagel. We're back again talking about everyone's favorite topic, tariffs. Because as you're probably aware, things have continued to escalate between Canada and the United States, with a lot of the discussion recently shifting away from the original complaints of fentanyl and immigration towards Canada's protectionist measures for various industries, and specifically the ridiculous tariff rates that the country allegedly charges on US imports, with Donald Trump recently claiming that the country charges 250% on dairy that's exported from the US, with many others online circulating the seemingly ridiculous rates that Canada charges on various imports, and sharing the sentiment that while Canadians have very much been up in arms around the sudden onset of a trade war with its largest trading partner, that they should really take a good hard look at their own tariff policies before wagging their fingers, with Donald Trump ultimately threatening to target dairy with reciprocal tariffs in April. And today I wanted to discuss Canada's protectionist measures and what tariff rates the country actually does charge on US imports. Because yes, while there is truth around the fact that Canada does have protectionist measures for various industries and various high tariff rates in select situations, a lot of the numbers being shared are just blatantly incorrect or otherwise misrepresentative of the reality of the situation. And probably the best data point to highlight this is to show that back in 2017, the ratio of duties to the value of imports coming from the United States sat at just 0.2%, which to crudely interpret is the effective tariff rate on US imports. And that was before signing the more recent USMCA agreement. So before the current trade war, the average tariff rate paid on US imports was likely even lower. And I know that tensions between the two sides are very heightened at the moment, given the rhetoric involved with this trade war, discussions of cutting off electricity to the United States, and of course the original discussions of annexing Canada. And I know that I said I didn't want to keep covering news coming out of the White House, but as a Canadian who works in finance, I really felt a need to address the discussions around tariffs and try in good faith to highlight what the current trade policies Canada currently has are. Because for the everyday Joe, these numbers are hard to come across. So when you see a tweet circulating with these ridiculous rates posted, it can be hard to verify whether they're true or not. And so today I'll share the resources for what I'm referencing here and what you can go to yourself to check these figures on your own time. Now, before jumping into Canada's tariff policy itself, we have to start the conversation with the mechanism that's ultimately driving this trade policy, with that being Canada's supply management of various key agricultural industries, namely dairy, chicken, eggs, turkey, and broiler hatching. You see, ever since the 1970s, with dairy being the first industry to experience this, the country has employed this somewhat controversial method of controlling supply within its country, with the goal of this being to stabilize prices, to avoid situations of, say, oversupply leading to plummeting prices, and farmers being unable to continue operating or making the long-term investments to continue functioning at a profitable rate. Now, the pro of the system is that it naturally benefits domestic farmers, allowing them to operate through periods of otherwise price volatility, which also allows them to operate without leaning on subsidies from the government during those periods, which is something we actually see in the United States, with the country setting a minimum price for dairy products in addition to other subsidy programs. The main con, however, is that outside the administrative frictions with running this type of program, dairy prices in Canada have generally been higher as a result, with the dairy group in the country often being compared to a cartel, with Fraser Institute highlighting that prices in Canada are $1.57 higher per liter than in the United States. It also makes it difficult for Canadian farmers to take advantage of opportunities outside the country and naturally limits the amount of imports that the country will ultimately let in, because the only way to control supply is to control imports, which naturally limits consumer options and can lead to less price competition. Now, with the US specifically, there is also the argument that Canadian farmers face higher standards than US dairy farmers, with the US allowing farmers to use artificial growth hormones, something that's not allowed in Canada or the EU. However, according to the American Cancer Society, fewer than 15% of cows in the United States are actually given this hormone. And even compared to the European Union and countries around the world, Canada has pretty high dairy prices, demonstrating that while the country might be avoiding the tax cost of subsidizing the industry, consumers are still paying for the policy. So that's Canada's supply management in a nutshell. And because of these policies, Canada has been relatively stiff about letting foreign countries into these protected markets, with a number of posts circulating recently highlighting that the country charges tariff rates of over 200% at times to keep others out of these industries, with some even suggesting that these tariffs on the United States expand even beyond the industries that are supply managed, which naturally paints a very different picture from that 0.2% effective rate we highlighted earlier. So what rates is Canada actually charging on US imports for these categories? Well, thankfully, there are a number of official documents that we can reference here to get to the bottom of that. For example, the World Trade Organization actually has a portal where you can go and see all the tariffs charged by different countries, albeit it's not the most user-friendly. So in this case, I'll actually be referencing this document from the Canada Border Services Agency, which offers an overview of all the tariff rates the country charges. And sure enough, if you go through some of the product categories here, you come across some pretty high rates. For example, you can see that for the over access commitment category, we have a 241% tariff for milk that's between 1% and 6% fat content, a 245.5% rate for fresh cheese, a rate of 238 to 249% for chicken, depending on how it's prepared, 154.5% to 165% for turkey, and 163.5% for eggs. So right away, when you compare these rates to popular tweets like this one, you do see that the high numbers specifically for the supply managed categories do somewhat line up. A number of others, however, do seem to be pulled out of thin air. For example, this Twitter post highlights that peanut butter is charged a tariff rate of nearly 300%, but in reality, you can see here that the MFN tariff, which stands for Most Favored Nation, or essentially any member of the World Trade Organization, is free. There is no tariff charged on peanut butter. So I'm not sure where some of these numbers are coming from, and even the ones that do exist are often misrepresented, such as barley seed, which has an over access commitment tariff of 94.5%. Nonetheless, it does show that Canada charges high tariff rates on certain product categories, even outside of its supply managed industries. However, you've probably noticed that every tariff we've highlighted here is only for, quote, over access commitment, which highlights the first main caveat and main counter argument we've seen circulating against these posts, which is that these tariff rates are not flat rates, but rather a component of something called a tariff rate quota, meaning they only apply to imports that are beyond a given quota or limit for a given category. The tariff for products within these commitment levels is often zero or a much lower rate than the one circulating. Now, the second thing you might notice in this document is that to the far right, we have this column titled Applicable Preferential Tariffs, under which we quite commonly see UST, which refers to the United States, which means that many of these tariff rate quotas don't actually apply to the United States because of our USMCA agreement, also known as the CUSMA or CUSMA agreement here in Canada. So to get the tariff rates applicable to US imports, we actually have to go to the agreement itself, where we can hop to Canada's tariff schedule to see that the US faces much more favorable rates than other trade partners, with the vast majority of goods seeing 0% tariffs regardless of the quantity imported, including items like barley and even lumber, items that incorrectly have been highlighted online as US industries tariffed by Canada. So that's the first main thing. Some of the numbers being circulated online are just flat out incorrect, or discussing industries that don't actually have any trade barriers between Canada and the United States. Where Canada does maintain these sort of tariff rate quotas is, again, generally for those industries that are supply managed in the country. We can see, for example, that in the agreement's tariff schedule, there's an asterisk next to the protected industry. And the agreement highlights the quota level for each product category that the US can bring in without triggering any of these rates. After the quota is met, however, imports are subject to the same over access commitment level as everyone else. And for these supply managed industries, the quotas do restrict market access, with the milk quota, for example, representing under 5% of available milk in Canada. And I know that some of these limits will lead to calls for Canada expanding US access to its various markets. But one thing worth highlighting is that even with these current limited amounts, the US hasn't even fully utilized the quotas it's been given. Canada actually tracks utilization of its quotas via its global affairs website. And you can see here, for example, for milk, in the 2023 to 2024 quota year, the US only utilized 13.7 million kilograms, or roughly a third of its allowed 41.7 million kilograms of quota. In fact, all other dairy categories, which have been the most discussed by the president here, have fallen meaningfully below their quota space, with many key categories like cream and again milk having room to roughly double imports or more without triggering any tariffs. Now, to be clear, that's just for dairy. For eggs and chicken, we do see the quotas mostly maxed out. And there is the argument that the reason the US hasn't exported more dairy products is because of other hurdles exporters have had to face in trying to access the Canadian market, with the US expressing grievances in the past regarding how Canada treats dairy under its USMCA agreement, with the US prevailing in one of its claims that Canada was prioritizing domestic producers, something that led to Canada updating its system, and the country then initiating a second panel review, arguing that the country violated limited terms of the agreement regarding what entities can receive TRQ allocations and technicalities on how the quotas are allocated and handled. But there it needs to be highlighted that A, in line with the terms of the agreement, the panel issued a final ruling in Canada's favor on the second case, meaning the country was not violating the terms of the agreement. B, again, this is Donald Trump's own agreement that he negotiated during his first term, meaning that the country is reneging on its own terms that it set out. And C, the US still has a trade surplus with Canada in dairy, meaning that even with these restrictions, the US sends more dairy to Canada than Canada sends down south, meaning that the US is actually targeting an industry that actually reduces its trade deficit, with Canada still being the second largest export market for US dairy. And I know that some will highlight that regardless of the circumstance, it's not fair that Canada restricts US imports via its tariff rate quotas. And yes, the US has generally been a more open market than Canada here, but kind of a final point I want to highlight is that under the USMCA agreement, the US also has quotas for certain categories. You can see, for example, that the US has a number of quotas for various agricultural products beyond which Canadian imports see a tariff, such as fluid cream, sour cream, ice cream, and milk beverages, which, mind you, doesn't actually include milk under 6% fat content. For this collective category, the US has a quota of 10.5 million liters, after which there's a tariff of 77.2 cents a liter, which, yes, does put it less than the Canadian tariff. I believe it would equate to roughly 10 to 30%, although I'm not 100% certain on that. But the reason that I highlight that is because while there's been a lot of discussion around reciprocating tariffs here, and this idea that the Trump administration might slap 250% tariffs on Canadian dairy products, if the countries took a true approach to reciprocating tariffs, then the US would simply copy Canada's tariff rate quota, which would mean that neither country would pay any more based on current trade balances. And there are areas where before the 2025 trade war and reciprocal tariffs, the US imposed one-sided tariffs on Canadian imports that weren't reciprocated, such as lumber, where the US not too long ago actually increased its tariff on Canadian lumber, despite Canada itself not imposing any tariffs on US lumber. And again, ironically, given some of the posts, peanut butter, where the US only this year dropped its quota against Canada, charging an over-access commitment rate of 131.8%, with both these industries only recently seeing Canadian tariffs as of March because of this trade war. So there is room for discussion around these policies for supply management, whether Canada should continue to protect its domestic farmers from a market that's over 10 times its size, or whether it should take the path of countries like Australia, which itself was able to phase out a similar program in favor of a freer market. And again, even domestically, these are hotly debated issues, and I'm not the one to decide what the right approach is. I'm not a policy expert, and I'm very keen to see those discussions play out. But there's not much point in discussing if it's done in bad faith, if people throw out bloated and misrepresentative figures to try and prove their point. After all, if this whole trade war is because of immigrants and fentanyl, none of this matters anyway. Regardless, hopefully this helps to clear the air and brings more information to the table for those genuinely interested in learning more. Thank you guys for joining me today. I hope you found this video helpful. As always, if you did, please do make sure to like, subscribe, all that good stuff. It does help the channel tremendously. Let me know your thoughts, whether you agree or disagree. And I'm very much biased here, but interested in genuine debate and discussion. So happy to hear those thoughts, agreeing or disagreeing down below. Thanks again for joining. And as always, be safe out there.